The Alpha King hadn't touched a woman in 9 years, then he saw her and said, "Bring me that lady." What happened next would either save them both, or destroy an entire kingdom. This is a story about broken souls, deadly secrets, and a choice that will change everything. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because what unfolds next will keep you on the edge of your seat until the very last word. The royal selection ceremony reeked of desperation disguised as grandeur. The acrid combination of burning torches, expensive perfumes, and the sharp metallic tang of barely contained ambition hung thick in the cold evening air. The ancient stone courtyard of the capital palace had been transformed into a theatrical stage where futures were bartered and alliances forged through bloodlines and beauty. Annie stood partially hidden behind a weathered stone archway near the eastern wall, observing the spectacle with the hollow awareness of someone who understood she was merely scenery in someone else's performance. She'd perfected the art of occupying space without claiming it, present but not participating, seen but not noticed. The selection happened once every decade, a carefully orchestrated tradition where the kingdom's most eligible women gathered to catch the eye of the Alpha King. Political theater at its finest, where treaties could be sealed with a glance and dynasties built on a single choice. For 9 years, these ceremonies had been suspended. Cancelled out of respect for a king too consumed by grief and rage to entertain the notion of choosing again. Until tonight. Until Alpha King Alfred decided, or more likely, was pressured by his council, to finally survey the offerings. Not that anyone truly believed he'd choose. Not after 9 years of self-imposed isolation. Not since Queen Isabella's murder had turned him from a just ruler into something cold and unreachable. A king who hadn't touched a woman, hadn't smiled, hadn't shown anything resembling warmth since the day his mate's poisoned body had been carried from the throne room. Annie shouldn't have been there at all. Thornwood wasn't even recognized as an official settlement anymore, it existed only as a cautionary tale whispered around fires, a village erased by flames 5 years ago, its survivors scattered like ash on the wind. She belonged to no pack, claimed no lineage, possessed no title. She was what the registry officers called displaced, a polite term for unwanted. Merchant Roderick had brought her to the capital, along with 3 other women from border towns, to fulfill the ceremonial quota. Every region was required to send candidates, even the forgotten territories. "You're young enough to pass," he'd said pragmatically, "and quiet enough not to cause problems. That's all they need, warm bodies to fill the courtyard." The courtyard blazed with calculated opulence. Hundreds of women stood arranged by region and rank, draped in silk gowns that caught the torchlight like liquid jewels, emerald greens, sapphire blues, ruby reds. Their hair had been sculpted into elaborate designs that must have taken hours. Jewelry glittered at throats and wrists, family heirlooms displayed like weapons in a war of status. The air vibrated with barely leashed power, dominant wolves sizing each other up, testing boundaries, asserting hierarchy through nothing more than presence and posture. Annie tugged self-consciously at the rough gray cloak that covered her shoulders and arms. Beneath it, she wore a simple dress of undyed linen, the only garment she owned that wasn't stained or frayed. The cloak served a dual purpose, hiding her poverty and concealing the burn scars that snaked up her left arm and shoulder like twisted vines. Roderick had insisted she keep them covered. "No one wants to see damage," he'd said matter-of-factly. "They're looking for perfection, not reminders of tragedy." She could still smell Thornwood burning. Even now, standing in the cold night air 5 years later, the phantom scent of charred wood and burning flesh would ambush her at unexpected moments. 23 people had died that night. 23 families, friends, neighbors. And Annie had survived. The guilt had followed her like a shadow ever since. A horn blast shattered the courtyard's tense anticipation. The sound cut through conversation and posturing with the finality of a judge's gavel. Every head turned toward the massive iron gates at the courtyard's northern end. The torches seemed to burn lower. The temperature dropped perceptibly, as if winter itself had been summoned. He emerged from the darkness like a storm-given form, inevitable, dangerous, magnetic. Alpha King Alfred stood easily over 6 feet tall, his frame radiating controlled violence even in the formal regalia of kingship. Dark hair fell past his collar in defiance of courtly fashion, framing a face carved by battle and hardship, all severe angles, a strong jaw marked by a scar that ran from temple to cheekbone, and eyes the color of storm clouds before lightning strikes. He wore black leather and chainmail beneath a fur-lined cloak that spoke of northern winters and harder men. This wasn't a king dressed to impress. This was a warrior who happened to wear a crown. Power rolled off him in waves so tangible Annie could feel it pressing against her skin from across the courtyard, cold iron and barely leashed fury and something wild that made her damaged wolf whimper and retreat deeper into her consciousness. This wasn't just strength. This was the bone-deep certainty of a creature that had killed, would kill again, and felt no hesitation about either. 9 years, the stories said. 9 years since Queen Isabella had been murdered by poison administered by trusted advisors, a betrayal so complete it had shattered something fundamental in the young king. 9 years since he'd touched a woman with anything resembling tenderness. He'd become a machine of duty and rage, all humanity burned away in the same fire of grief that had consumed his heart. Looking at him now, watching those storm cloud eyes sweep over the assembled women with absolute indifference, Annie believed every terrible rumor. Alfred moved through the courtyard like death incarnate. He surveyed the presented candidates with the clinical detachment of a man inspecting livestock he had no intention of purchasing. One by one, noble women straightened under his gaze, some preening, others trembling. He looked through them as if they were transparent. And then, his eyes found hers. The world contracted to the space between them. Annie couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't look away from those storm-gray eyes that had suddenly sharpened with focus. For 9 years, Alfred had looked at candidates with indifference. But now, staring at the scarred woman hiding behind a stone archway in a gray cloak, something in his expression shifted. Recognition. His voice cut through the silence like a blade drawn in the dark, commanding and absolute. "Bring me that lady." The courtyard erupted into chaos. But Annie heard none of it over the pounding of her own heart. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to disappear the way she'd always disappeared when powerful wolves took notice. But Alfred's eyes held her frozen. And somewhere deep in her damaged wolf's consciousness, something stirred that felt dangerously close to hope. What neither of them knew in that moment was that this choice, this impossible, protocol-shattering choice, would set into motion events that would either heal 2 broken souls, or tear an entire kingdom apart at the seams. Annie's legs moved without her permission. Strong hands, belonging to guards whose faces she couldn't focus on, guided her forward through a corridor of staring faces. The crowd parted like water around a stone, and the whispers followed her like a physical weight. She caught fragments. Who is she? Look at that cloak, is she a servant? From where? Why her? She wanted to answer them. She didn't know. The distance between the archway and the raised platform where Alfred stood felt infinite and instantaneous all at once. Then she was there, standing 3 steps below him, close enough to see the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples, close enough to smell leather and steel and something wild like a forest after rain. Alfred descended the steps with deliberate slowness. Each footfall echoed against stone. He circled her, not quickly, not with any urgency, but with the methodical assessment of a predator determining whether something was prey, threat, or beneath notice entirely. Annie kept her eyes forward, her spine straight despite every instinct screaming at her to make herself smaller. Her wolf pressed flat in her mind, silent and trembling. "Your name." His voice was closer now, just behind her left shoulder. Not a question. A command. "Annie." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "Annie of Thornwood." He completed his circle, stopping directly in front of her. Up close, his eyes were even more unsettling, gray like winter storms, but empty of warmth. He studied her face with an intensity that felt like being dissected. "Thornwood." He repeated the word slowly, as if testing its weight. "The settlement that burned." "Yes, Your Majesty." "5 years ago." "Yes." Something flickered across his expression, too quick to name, gone before she could identify it. His gaze dropped from her face to the cloak pulled tight around her shoulders, to the way her left hand gripped the fabric. "Show me your arm." Annie's breath caught. Around them, the courtyard had gone silent. Hundreds of wolves watching, waiting. She could feel their curiosity like insects crawling across her skin. "Your Majesty, I." That wasn't a request. His tone hadn't changed, still flat, still emotionless, but the command in it was absolute. Annie's fingers trembled as she loosened her grip on the cloak. The fabric slipped from her left shoulder, exposing the burned scars that twisted from her collarbone down her arm in mottled patterns of healed tissue. In the torchlight, they looked even worse, raised, discolored, a permanent map of the night Thornwood died. She heard the intake of breath from the watching crowd. Felt their judgment like a brand. Alfred's expression didn't change. He reached out, slowly enough that she could have pulled away, but she didn't, and traced one finger along the largest scar that ran from her shoulder to her elbow. His touch was surprisingly gentle. Clinical, but not cruel. How did you get these? Annie met his eyes. She'd learned long ago that the truth was simpler than lies, even when it hurt. I survived when I shouldn't have. For the first time since he'd entered the courtyard, something cracked in Alfred's carefully controlled expression. Not sympathy, nothing so soft as that, but recognition. The look of someone who understood exactly what those words meant. What they cost to say. He withdrew his hand, his jaw tightening. When he spoke again, his voice carried across the silent courtyard with ringing finality. She'll remain in the palace. Prepare chambers in the east wing. The crowd erupted. Shocked murmurs became loud protests from noble women who'd been dismissed without a second glance. Someone shouted about protocol. Another voice demanded explanation. But Alfred had already turned away, his inner circle moving to flank him as he strode toward the palace entrance without looking back. Annie stood frozen on the platform, her cloak hanging loose, her scars exposed to hundreds of staring eyes. She didn't understand what had just happened. Didn't understand why a king known for 9 years of isolation had looked at her damaged skin and decided she was worth keeping. An older man with kind eyes and a steward's insignia approached her, his movements unhurried despite the chaos around them. He draped her cloak properly back over her shoulders with practiced efficiency. Miss Annie, I'm Marcus. I serve His Majesty as head steward. His voice was warm, a stark contrast to Alfred's cold monotone. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your chambers. Annie followed because she didn't know what else to do. Marcus led her through corridors of carved stone and tapestried walls, past guards who watched her with curious eyes, up staircases worn smooth by centuries of feet. The palace was a maze of wealth and history that made her Thornwood cottage seem like a child's toy by comparison. The chambers Marcus finally opened were larger than the entire tavern where she'd been working. A 4-poster bed dominated one wall, draped in deep blue fabric. Windows overlooked gardens she could barely make out in the darkness. A fire already crackled in an enormous hearth. I don't understand, Annie said quietly, still standing in the doorway. Why would he choose me? Marcus busied himself lighting additional candles, his weathered face thoughtful. His Majesty hasn't chosen anyone in 9 years. Hasn't looked at anyone with interest. Hasn't felt anything, if I'm being honest, since Queen Isabella died. He turned to face her, and the sadness in his expression was genuine. She was poisoned, you know. Slowly, over months, by advisors he trusted. People who smiled in his face while murdering his mate. By the time he discovered the truth, she was already gone. Marcus paused. It broke something in him. He's been haunted ever since, unable to trust, unable to feel, unable to move forward. He rules because duty demands it, but he's been more ghost than man. Annie thought about the emptiness she'd seen in Alfred's eyes. The recognition when he'd looked at her scars. He saw someone else who survived when they shouldn't have. Perhaps. Marcus moved toward the door, then stopped. Or perhaps he saw someone who understands that survival and living aren't the same thing. He offered her a small, sad smile. Get some rest, Miss Annie. Tomorrow, His Majesty will want to speak with you again. And I suspect that conversation will determine a great deal about both your futures. When he left, Annie stood alone in chambers far too grand for someone like her, surrounded by luxury she'd never earned, chosen by a king she didn't understand for reasons that made no sense. She walked to the window and stared out at the darkened gardens, touching the scars on her arm. Somewhere in this vast palace, a broken king was probably asking himself the same question she was. What happened when two people who'd survived their tragedies finally looked at each other and saw something other than emptiness? Annie didn't have an answer yet. But she had the strangest feeling that whatever came next would change them both forever. The summons came at dawn. A sharp knock, a guard's formal voice through the door. His Majesty requests your presence for breakfast, Miss Annie. I'm to escort you immediately. She'd barely slept, spending most of the night sitting by the window watching unfamiliar stars above an unfamiliar city. Now she followed the guard through corridors she didn't recognize, deeper into the palace's heart, until they stopped before heavy oak doors guarded by 2 wolves whose dominance made her skin prickle. The guard opened the doors, and Annie stepped into chaos. This wasn't a dining room. It was a war room, a massive chamber dominated by a table buried under maps, reports, and correspondence marked with wax seals. The walls were covered in charts tracking troop movements, supply lines, territorial boundaries. A strategic map of the entire kingdom hung on the far wall, marked with colored pins she couldn't decipher. The smell of ink and parchment overwhelmed any scent of food. Alfred stood at the head of the table, still dressed in the black leather from last night, studying a report with the focused intensity of a man who hadn't slept either. He didn't look up when she entered. Sit. A single chair had been placed opposite him. Between them sat a modest breakfast, bread, cheese, dried fruit, looking absurdly domestic among the military paperwork. Annie sat, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. Alfred set down the report with deliberate precision. When his storm-gray eyes finally met hers, they held the same empty coldness from the courtyard. Tell me about Thornwood's destruction. Start from the beginning. Not good morning. Not how did you sleep. Just straight into interrogation. Annie had expected this. Kings didn't choose random scarred women without wanting answers. The fire started during the harvest festival, she began, keeping her voice steady. We were all in the village hall. Someone said later that oil lamps had been knocked over, but others claimed they saw figures running from the building before it caught. She paused. I don't know which is true. I just know that within minutes, the entire hall was burning and the doors were blocked. You were inside. Yes. For how long? I don't know exactly. Long enough to watch the ceiling beams start to fall. Long enough to hear. She stopped, swallowed hard. Long enough. Alfred's expression didn't soften, but something shifted in his posture. He leaned forward slightly. How did you escape? I didn't. Someone pulled me out through a collapsing doorway. I never saw who. When I woke up, I was lying in the grass and Thornwood was ash. Her fingers tightened in her lap. 23 people died. I was the only one who made it out of that hall alive. Why did you come to the selection ceremony? The abrupt change in direction caught her off guard. Merchant Roderick brought me. He needed to fill his quota of candidates from the borderlands. That's not what I asked. Alfred's voice remained flat, but his eyes sharpened. Why did you agree to come? Annie met his gaze directly. Because I had nowhere else to go. Because living in a tavern serving drinks to men who either pitied me or ignored me felt like drowning slowly. Because I thought maybe being invisible in a crowd of beautiful women was better than being invisible alone. She paused. And because I knew you wouldn't choose me, so there was no risk of actually being seen. Something flickered across Alfred's face, too quick to catch, but it looked almost like recognition again. Show me your wolf. Annie's breath caught. Your Majesty, my wolf isn't like other wolves. The fire damaged something. I can't shift properly. I didn't ask you to shift. I asked you to show me your wolf. He stood, moving around the table with that same predatory grace from last night. Let her surface. Just her eyes. That's all. Every instinct told Annie this was dangerous. Her wolf had been quiet, hidden, protective for 5 years. Letting her out, even partially, meant exposing the last vulnerable part of herself she'd managed to keep safe. But Alfred was waiting, and somehow saying no to him felt impossible. Annie closed her eyes and reached inward, toward the small scared creature that lived in the darkest corner of her consciousness. Her wolf stirred reluctantly, wary, but responded to Annie's coaxing. The shift was immediate and painful. Annie gasped as her eyes changed, her wolf looking out through them at the Alpha King. When she opened them again, Alfred had gone completely still. His own eyes had shifted too, no longer gray but glowing with his wolf's presence, pale and luminous and ancient. They stared at each other across 3 feet of charged air. Annie's wolf should have been cowering, submitting, exposing her throat to such overwhelming dominance. Instead, she was curious. Watchful. Unafraid in a way that made no sense. Fascinating, Alfred murmured, his voice rougher now with his wolf's influence. He circled her slowly, and Annie's wolf tracked his movement with calm interest. Your wolf isn't broken, Annie. She's been protecting you the only way she knows how, by staying hidden, staying small, keeping you safe from anything that might hurt you again. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his wolf's glowing eyes. But she's not hiding from me. I don't understand why, Annie whispered, her voice strange with her wolf still present. Neither do I. Alfred pulled his wolf back, and Annie followed suit, both returning to human eyes. The loss of connection felt like cold water. He moved back to his seat, picking up his untouched cup with hands that weren't quite steady. When I scented you across that courtyard last night, something in me responded. Not desire. Not attraction. Something deeper. He paused, staring into his cup. It was the first thing I felt beyond rage in 9 years. The admission hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. I don't know what you are to me yet, Alfred continued, his voice returning to that flat, controlled tone. But I know you're something. And I need to understand what that means. His eyes met hers again, and this time there was a plea hidden beneath the coldness. Stay. Help me figure this out. Please. The please broke something in Annie's chest. This powerful king, this dominant alpha who could command anything he wanted, was asking. Not ordering. Asking. I'll stay, she said quietly. For as long as you need me to. Alfred nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin, then returned his attention to the reports on his desk. But Annie saw the way his shoulders lowered fractionally, the way some tension bled from his jaw. Whatever strange connection existed between a broken king and a scarred survivor, they'd just agreed to explore it together. Annie only hoped they'd both survive what they discovered. 3 weeks passed in careful routine. Breakfast in the war room. Afternoon walks through the palace gardens where Alfred spoke little and Annie learned to be comfortable with silence. Evenings where he reviewed petitions while she sat by the fire with books Marcus brought her. They were circling each other, Annie realized, 2 wary creatures trying to understand what they'd found without getting close enough to cause damage. Then one morning, Alfred appeared at her chamber door instead of sending a guard. Come with me. He didn't wait for her answer, already turning down the corridor toward a part of the palace she'd never seen. Annie followed, pulling a shawl over her shoulders against the draft that seemed to grow colder as they climbed a narrow spiral staircase in the oldest wing. They stopped before a door marked with a heavy lock. Alfred produced a key from inside his coat, the only key, Annie suspected, given how his fingers hesitated before inserting it. The lock turned with a grinding protest of disuse. The door opened onto a tower room flooded with morning light from windows on all sides. And in the center, dominating everything, hung a portrait of a woman so beautiful Annie's breath caught. Isabella had dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders, warm brown eyes that seemed to hold laughter even in oil paint, and a smile that suggested she'd known exactly how loved she was. She wore a simple green dress and held wildflowers in her hands, not the formal regalia of a queen, but something far more intimate. Personal. Candles surrounded the portrait. Dozens of them, some burned low, others fresh. All lit, casting dancing shadows across Isabella's painted face. They're never allowed to go out, Alfred said quietly, his voice rough. Marcus replaces them before they can. 9 years of constant vigil. Annie said nothing. She understood shrines to the dead. Understood the desperate need to keep some light burning against the darkness of loss. Alfred moved to the window, his back to the portrait, staring out at the kingdom spread below. She was kind. Not just nice, actually kind, in the way that costs something. His hands gripped the stone sill. She believed every person in this kingdom deserved protection, not just the powerful. She wanted schools in every settlement, healers trained and sent to the borderlands, laws that actually served the vulnerable instead of just the nobility. He was quiet for so long Annie thought he'd finished. Then his voice came again, harder now, edged with something raw. She died over 7 months. 7 months of watching her grow weaker while the physicians claimed it was a wasting sickness, something in her blood they couldn't fix. 7 months of holding her while she suffered, watching the light leave her eyes a little more each day. His shoulders tensed. And the entire time, the people who were poisoning her, trusted advisors, men who'd sworn loyalty, who I'd considered friends, they smiled in my court. They brought her flowers. They expressed their concern. Annie heard the crack in his voice before she saw it. Alfred's reflection in the window showed his jaw clenched so tight it must have hurt, his eyes bright with fury that had nowhere to go. I should have known. The words came out broken. I should have protected her. That was my job, the only thing that mattered, and I failed. I failed her completely. Annie watched him in the window's reflection, this powerful king coming apart at the seams, and recognized the shape of his guilt. It mirrored her own so perfectly it hurt. I wasn't inside the hall when the fire started, she said quietly. Alfred's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't turn around. I'd stepped outside for air. The harvest festival was loud and crowded, and I wanted a moment of quiet. Annie moved closer to the portrait, studying Isabella's painted smile. I heard the screams before I saw the flames. My mother's voice, I could pick it out above all the others. She was calling my name. Her hands clenched in her shawl. I tried to get to the doors, but they were blocked. The heat drove me back. I stood there screaming while the building burned with everyone I loved inside. And then someone grabbed me, I never saw who, and pulled me away. When I woke up, Thornwood was ash and I was alive. She turned to face Alfred's back. 23 people burned to death. 23 people who'd been kind to the orphaned girl, who'd fed me and clothed me and given me a place to belong. And I survived because I'd wanted a moment of quiet air. I survived when I shouldn't have. Annie repeated the words that had haunted her for 5 years, and I've never forgiven myself. Because survival feels like theft when everyone else is dead. Alfred finally turned from the window. His storm gray eyes met hers across the tower room, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was no coldness in them. Just raw, bleeding understanding. They tell you it wasn't your fault, he said hoarsely. The council, the advisors. They say I couldn't have known, that poisoners are skilled at deception, that I shouldn't carry the blame. His voice cracked again. But it doesn't matter what they say. Because I should have known. I should have felt it. I should have protected her. And I should have stayed inside, Annie whispered. I should have died with them. The words hung in the tower like ghosts between them. Two people speaking the same confession in different languages, finally understanding that the weight they carried had the same shape even if the details differed. Something stirred in Annie's chest, her wolf rising unbidden, pushing forward with unprecedented strength. She felt Alfred's wolf respond, surfacing in his eyes without either of them consciously calling them forth. Their wolves looked at each other across the tower room, and Annie felt the recognition slam through her with physical force. Not desire. Not the mate bond that legend spoke of. Something deeper and more painful, the recognition of shared damage. Of two creatures who'd learned to survive in the ruins of their guilt and didn't know how to do anything else. Alfred's wolf made a low sound, not aggressive, almost questioning. Annie's wolf responded with her own soft whine and acknowledgement. We see you. We understand. You're not alone in drowning. When they pulled their wolves back and returned to human eyes, the silence that followed felt different. Less like walls and more like shared ground. I don't know how to stop feeling like I failed her, Alfred said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual cold control. I don't know how to stop feeling like I stole life from people who deserved it more, Annie answered with equal honesty. Alfred's mouth twisted into something that might have been attempting a smile but couldn't quite manage it. We're quite the pair. Drowning in guilt neither of us can escape, Annie agreed. At least we're drowning together. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't healing. But it was the first honest thing either of them had shared with another person in years. And in that tower room, surrounded by candles that refused to let darkness claim Isabella's memory, two broken people acknowledged that sometimes being seen in your worst moment was the only thing that made survival bearable. Marcus burst into the library where Annie had been reading, his normally composed face drawn tight with fear. Miss Annie, you need to come. Now. He was already moving back toward the door, not waiting to see if she followed. It's His Majesty. His wolf, he's lost control. Annie's book hit the floor as she ran after him. They moved through corridors at a pace that left her breathless, out through the palace gates, across grounds she'd never explored, toward the dark line of forest that marked the kingdom's northern boundary. She could hear the snarling before she saw anything, a sound that raised every hair on her body and made her own wolf whimper in instinctive fear. The royal guard had formed a wide perimeter at the forest's edge, weapons drawn but clearly terrified to get closer. Commander Celine stood at the front, her sword half-raised, her face grim. He received news an hour ago, she said without preamble when Marcus and Annie reached her. Another attack. A village called Millbrook, 23 dead, including children. He read the report, said nothing, walked out here, and shifted. He's been like this since. We can't get close. Annie's eyes found him then. Alfred's wolf was massive, easily twice the size of any normal wolf, his fur the color of storm clouds, his eyes burning with that same pale luminescence she'd seen in the tower. But this wasn't the curious, watchful wolf that had studied her in the war room. This was rage given form, pacing in tight circles, snarling at nothing and everything, power radiating off him in waves so thick the air itself seemed to vibrate. He's processing 9 years of suppressed emotion all at once, Annie said quietly, understanding clicking into place. It's not just this attack. It's every attack, every failure, every person he couldn't protect. It's all coming out. He'll kill anyone who approaches, Celine warned. Miss Annie, I appreciate that you've developed some rapport with His Majesty, but that, she gestured toward the pacing wolf, that isn't him right now. That's pure instinct and fury. Annie was already moving forward. Miss Annie, wait. But she didn't stop. Her wolf was surging up without being called, surfacing with a strength that sent pain lancing through Annie's body, the incomplete shift still agonizing after all these years. But she pushed through it, letting her wolf look out through her eyes as she walked steadily toward the massive gray wolf that had stopped pacing to watch her approach. His lips were pulled back, fangs bared, a warning growl rumbling from his chest. Behind her, Annie heard Celine shout something, but the words were meaningless. All that mattered was the wolf in front of her, drowning in rage and guilt and grief that had nowhere to go. I know you're angry, Annie said softly, her voice strange with her wolf's presence threading through it. She kept walking, slowly, hands visible and empty. I know it feels like you're failing. 23 more people dead. 23 more souls you couldn't protect. Alfred's wolf snarled louder, taking a threatening step toward her. I know what it's like, Annie continued, closing the distance to 10 feet, then 5. To carry the weight of every person you couldn't save. To feel like your survival is an insult to their deaths. To wake up every morning wondering why you're still breathing when they're not. 3 feet now. Close enough to see the blood staining his muzzle, not from any victim, she realized, but from his own jaws where he'd been biting down hard enough to draw blood. You're not alone in this, she whispered. You're not the only one drowning in guilt that never stops. You're not the only one who doesn't know how to keep living when it feels like you've already failed everyone who mattered. Alfred's wolf went very still. His growling stopped. Those luminous pale eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that would have been terrifying if Annie had any self-preservation left. I see you, she said, her voice breaking. Not the king. Not the failure. Just you. And you're allowed to break. You're allowed to feel this. You don't have to be strong every single moment. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Alfred's massive wolf took one step forward and pressed his head against her chest. The impact nearly knocked Annie backward, but she caught her balance and wrapped her arms around his neck. He was trembling, this powerful, dominant wolf, shaking like something fragile and breaking. Annie held him, feeling his wolf's anguish pouring through the contact between them, and her own wolf pressed close in response, offering the only comfort she knew how to give, you're not alone in this darkness. The shift happened so suddenly Annie barely registered it. One moment she was holding a massive wolf, the next, Alfred was human again, naked and on his knees in the dirt, his arms wrapped around her waist, his face pressed against her stomach. And he was weeping, raw, broken sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep and vital. Annie dropped to her knees with him, her arms still around his shoulders, and let him break against her. She didn't speak. Didn't offer empty comfort. Just held him while 9 years of suppressed grief finally found its way out. Behind them, she heard Celine quietly ordering the guards to fall back, to give them space. Then there was only the sound of Alfred's ragged breathing and the wind through the trees. When he finally pulled back enough to look at her, his face was streaked with dirt and tears, his eyes red and devastated and more human than she'd ever seen them. You're the only one who sees me, he said hoarsely. Not the king. Not the failure. Just me. Annie cupped his face with scarred hands, holding his gaze. Maybe that's what we are to each other. Reminders that surviving isn't the same as living. That being broken doesn't mean we stop mattering. Alfred's laugh was bitter and broken, but real. We're terrible at living. The worst, Annie agreed softly. But maybe we can learn together. Maybe 2 people who are terrible at it can figure it out better than 1 person drowning alone. He leaned his forehead against hers, his breathing still unsteady, his hands gripping her arms like she was the only solid thing in a collapsing world. Stay, he whispered. Please. I can't, I need you to stay. I'm here, Annie promised, and meant it with everything she had. I'm not going anywhere. They knelt together in the dirt at the forest's edge, a king who'd forgotten how to feel and a survivor who'd forgotten how to live, holding on to each other like lifelines in the dark. It wasn't healing. But it was a beginning. The morning after the forest, Alfred appeared at Annie's door at dawn without the usual guard escort. His eyes were still shadowed with exhaustion, but something had shifted in the way he held himself, less rigid, more human. "Walk with me," he said simply. The gardens were silver with dew, the sun just beginning to crest the eastern wall. Alfred led them down winding paths between rose bushes Isabella had planted, past fountains that sang with falling water, through archways covered in climbing ivy. For the first 10 minutes, neither spoke. But the silence felt different now, not walls between them, but shared space. "I used to come here with her every morning," Alfred said finally, pausing beside a marble bench. "She'd make me leave the war room, drag me outside, force me to look at something beautiful before dealing with the kingdom's problems." His mouth twisted. "I resented it sometimes. Thought it was wasted time." "And now?" Annie asked quietly. "Now I'd give anything for one more morning of wasted time." He sat on the bench, and Annie joined him. She believed beauty mattered. That protecting people meant more than just keeping them alive, it meant giving them something worth living for. Annie thought of Thornwood's small gardens, the way her mother had grown herbs even when food was scarce. She was right. Alfred glanced at her, and for the first time since they'd met, something almost like warmth touched his expression. Yes. She was. They walked the gardens every morning after that. Alfred would talk about Isabella sometimes, about the kingdom's problems other times, about nothing at all occasionally. Annie learned to read his silences, when they meant he was thinking versus when they meant he was struggling. And slowly, carefully, Alfred began asking questions that weren't interrogations. "What did you do in Thornwood?" "Before the fire." They were sitting on the bench again, 3 days after that first walk. Annie pulled her shawl tighter against the morning chill. "I was training as a healer. My mother was the village herbalist. She taught me which plants could ease pain, stop infection, bring down fevers." She touched her pocket unconsciously, feeling the small bundle of dried lavender she still carried. "I still gather herbs. Can't seem to stop, even though I haven't treated anyone in 5 years." Alfred studied her with that sharp focus she was learning meant genuine interest. "Why did you stop?" "Because healing people means getting close to them. And getting close means losing them eventually." She met his eyes. "After Thornwood, I couldn't risk that again." He understood. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened with recognition. Isolation feels safer than vulnerability. Always, Annie agreed. The strategy session started the second week. Alfred would summon her to the war room in the afternoons, spread reports across the table about border disputes or supply chain problems, and simply ask, "What do you see?" At first, Annie thought he was testing her. But she quickly realized he was actually listening, weighing her observations, asking follow-up questions, sometimes implementing her suggestions. She had a gift for reading between lines, for noticing what people weren't saying. Years of making herself invisible had taught her to observe, and those observations often revealed truths others missed. "You're brilliant at this," Alfred said one afternoon after she'd identified a pattern in the attack reports that suggested coordination rather than random violence. "How did I not see it?" "You're too close," Annie replied, studying the map. "You see every attack as a personal failure. I see them as data points." She glanced up. "Sometimes distance is useful. And sometimes," Alfred said quietly, "closeness is necessary." The evenings were Annie's favorite. After dinner, they'd retreat to Alfred's private study, smaller than the war room, lined with books, dominated by a fireplace large enough to stand in. Alfred would review petitions or correspondence while Annie read from his extensive library. But inevitably, one of them would say something, and they'd end up talking instead. "Did you always want to be king?" Annie asked one night, curled in a chair with a book of poetry she'd found. Alfred looked up from his papers, surprised by the question. "No. I wanted to be a scholar, actually. Study philosophy, maybe teach." He set down his pen. "But my father died young, and suddenly I was king at 23 with no preparation and a kingdom that didn't trust me yet." "You must have been terrified." "Constantly." His smile was bitter. "Isabella helped with that. She was better at people than I ever was, knew how to make them feel heard, valued." She should have been the one wearing the crown. Annie closed her book. But she chose you instead. That says something about who you were before the grief. Alfred was quiet for a long moment. I used to laugh, he said finally, his voice distant with memory. I loved terrible jokes. I'd write poetry, awful, overwrought poetry that Isabella would mock mercilessly. I dreamed of building schools in every settlement, training healers, and sending them to the borderlands, creating a kingdom where everyone had access to knowledge regardless of birth. He looked at the fire. That person feels like someone I read about in a history book. Someone who died 9 years ago. Or someone who's been sleeping, Annie suggested softly. Waiting for a reason to wake up. His eyes met hers across the study, and the vulnerability in them took her breath. Is that what you're doing? Giving me reasons? Maybe, Annie admitted. Or maybe I'm finding my own reasons while I'm at it. 3 weeks after the forest incident, they'd built something neither could quite name but both recognized as vital. Alfred smiled occasionally now, small, fleeting things, but real. He listened more than he commanded. He asked Annie's opinion before making decisions that affected the borderlands, valued her insights on disputes involving common folk. And Annie found herself carrying fewer herbs in her pockets and more confidence in her spine. She spoke up in strategy sessions without fear of being dismissed. She challenged Alfred's assumptions when she thought he was wrong. She allowed herself to care about palace staff, to remember their names, to build fragile connections. One evening, sitting by the fire while Alfred read poetry aloud, his terrible, beautiful poetry from before, Annie realized she was laughing. Actually laughing, the sound strange and unfamiliar in her own ears. Alfred stopped mid-verse, staring at her with something like wonder. I've never heard you laugh before. I've never had a reason to. Annie wiped her eyes, still smiling. That poem was truly awful, by the way. Her eyes like stars in Midnight's Keep? Really? I was 22 and convinced I was profound, Alfred said, but he was almost smiling too. Isabella said the same thing. She made me burn most of them. She had excellent judgment. She did. Alfred set the book aside. She'd have liked you, I think. You both had that same quality, seeing people clearly without judgment. Annie held his gaze. I think I would have liked her too. The moment stretched between them, warm and comfortable and tinged with the bittersweetness of grief acknowledged but no longer suffocating. They were learning, Annie realized. Learning to trust, to connect, to believe that maybe surviving could transform into actual living if you found the right person to attempt it with. It wasn't healing. Not yet. But it was trust, built slowly over dawn walks and strategy sessions and evenings by the fire. And trust, Annie was discovering, was its own kind of miracle. Commander Celine arrived during breakfast on a gray morning in the 7th week, her face carved from stone, a leather folder clutched in her hand. She didn't wait for invitation, simply strode into the war room and spread documents across the table with the precision of a battle plan. I have him, she said flatly. Lord Kieran Blackstone. He's been orchestrating the village attacks. Alfred's cup hit the table hard enough that tea sloshed over the rim. Annie felt the temperature in the room drop as his entire body went still, the predator stillness that preceded violence. Show me. Celine laid it out with military efficiency. Supply chain records showing Kieran purchasing weapons through intermediaries. Correspondence intercepted between Kieran and known mercenaries. Testimony from a captured rogue who named Kieran as the source of their coin and orders. And finally, carefully preserved samples from Isabella's chambers, traces of the same rare poison found in Kieran's private estate during a discreet search. He's been planning this for a decade, Celine said, her voice tight with controlled fury. The village attacks were designed to destabilize your rule, make you look weak and ineffective. And Isabella, she stopped, her jaw working. He was part of the conspiracy from the beginning. We just couldn't prove it until now. Alfred hadn't moved. His hands were flat on the table, his breathing carefully controlled, but Annie could see the rage building beneath his skin like magma under stone. His wolf was rising, pressing against his control with murderous intent. Summon the High Council, he said, his voice utterly empty. Now. Within the hour, the council chamber was filled with the kingdom's most powerful wolves. Alfred sat at the head of the table, Celine standing beside him presenting evidence while the councillors erupted into chaos. This is circumstantial at best. Lord Kieran has served this kingdom faithfully. We cannot accuse a nobleman of such crimes without absolute proof. Absolute proof? Counselor Marcus, not the steward, but a grizzled warrior who'd fought beside Alfred's father, slammed his fist on the table. The queen died slowly while this bastard watched and smiled. 23 people burned in Millbrook. How much blood needs to be spilled before you call it proof? Due process must be observed. Due process? He poisoned the queen. Alfred sat perfectly still through all of it, his storm-gray eyes fixed on the evidence spread before him, his expression utterly blank. But Annie, standing in the corner where Marcus had positioned her before the meeting, could see what the counselors couldn't, the trembling in Alfred's hands, the rigid set of his shoulders, the wolf burning in his eyes just beneath the surface. He was going to lose control. Going to shift right here and hunt Kieran down through the palace corridors and tear him apart before witnesses and law and justice could even be considered. 9 years of rage finally having a target, and nothing would stop him. Annie moved before thought could catch up. She stepped forward from the corner, her voice cutting through the arguing counselors with unexpected clarity. Challenge him to single combat under ancient law. The room went silent. Every head turned toward her, this scarred woman with no title, no rank, no right to speak in a high council meeting. But Annie kept her eyes on Alfred, watching his wolf-bright gaze snap to hers with predatory focus. Let him answer for his crimes before the kingdom, she continued, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Not in this chamber where politics and doubt can muddy truth, but in the arena where only skill and honor matter. If he's innocent as he claims, let him prove it with his life on the line. If he's guilty, let justice be witnessed by everyone he's wronged. Single combat hasn't been invoked in 40 years. The law still stands, Annie interrupted, still holding Alfred's gaze. Public justice, not private vengeance. Let the kingdom see their king fight for truth, not watch him become the monster his rage wants him to be. Something shifted in Alfred's expression, the wolf receding slightly, cold calculation returning. He saw what she was offering, a path that satisfied both his need for Kieran's blood and the kingdom's need for legitimate justice. Not murder in the dark, but execution witnessed and sanctioned. Send for Lord Kieran, Alfred said, his voice blade sharp. Inform him he's been accused of treason, murder, and conspiracy against the crown. Under ancient law, I challenge him to trial by combat. Let him accept or be branded coward before every pack in 5 kingdoms. The council erupted again, but Alfred was already standing, already moving toward the door. He paused beside Annie, his hand briefly touching her shoulder, a gesture so quick the counselors might have missed it, but she felt the tremor in his fingers, the barely leashed violence. Thank you, he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. For seeing me clearly enough to stop me from becoming exactly what he tried to make me. Then he was gone, leaving Annie surrounded by arguing counselors and the weight of what she'd just set in motion. Kieran accepted the challenge within hours, his confidence obvious. He was younger than Alfred by 5 years, known for his skill in combat, certain his speed would overcome the king's raw power. The date was set for 7 days hence, time enough for word to spread, for witnesses to gather, for the kingdom to hold its breath. Alfred trained like a man possessed. Every morning in the practice yard, fighting opponents who rotated through in waves, pushing his body past exhaustion and into something harder. Annie watched from the gallery, her hands clenched white-knuckled on the stone railing, terror warring with faith in her chest. On the 3rd day, Alfred paused between bouts and looked up at her, sweat-soaked and breathing hard. You're afraid, he called up. Terrified, Annie admitted. Of what? That I'll watch another person I care about die. That survival will steal from me again. The words escaped before she could stop them, raw and honest. I can't lose you, Alfred. I've only just found you. Something in his expression softened. He climbed the gallery stairs, ignoring his waiting opponents, and stood before her still breathing hard from exertion. I'm not planning to die. Plans don't always matter. No, he agreed quietly. They don't. He reached out, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear with surprising gentleness. But I have something I didn't have 9 years ago when Isabella died. I have a reason to come back. Someone who sees me clearly and asks me to be better than my worst impulses. Annie's throat tightened. Is that what I am? A reason? You're everything, Alfred said simply. You're the first person in 9 years who made me want to keep fighting instead of just going through the motions. His hand cupped her scarred cheek. So I'll win. Because losing means leaving you alone again, and I won't do that to either of us. He returned to training, but something had settled in Annie's chest, not peace, but purpose. She'd found him across a crowded courtyard. She'd held him through his breaking in the forest. She'd built trust with him over dawn walks and evening poetry. She'd be damned if she let him face Kieran's blade without every bit of strength she could offer through her presence alone. 7 days suddenly felt far too short. The ancient arena had been carved from living stone 3 centuries ago, when kings still settled disputes through blood and honor. It rose from the earth at the kingdom's heart, circular, open to the sky, with stone tiers that could hold thousands. And on the morning of the trial, every seat was filled. Annie stood in the royal gallery beside Marcus and Commander Celine, her hands gripping the cold stone railing hard enough to hurt. Below, the arena floor was bare earth, raked smooth, marked only by the ancient symbols that designated the combat circle. Around them, the crowd pressed close, nobility in their fine clothes, common folk who'd traveled for days to witness this, representatives from every pack and settlement. The air hummed with barely contained energy and the weight of collective anticipation. Across the arena, Lord Kieran Blackstone entered through the Challenger's Gate. He was tall, lean, moving with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never truly feared losing. His dark hair was pulled back, his expression almost amused as he surveyed the crowd. When his eyes found Annie in the royal gallery, he smiled, cold and calculating, and she felt ice slide down her spine. Then the King's Gate opened, and Alfred emerged. He wore nothing but simple leather pants, his chest bare, every scar from years of combat visible. But it wasn't his appearance that silenced the murmuring crowd, it was his presence. Power rolled off him in waves, his wolf so close to the surface that his eyes already glowed with that pale luminescence. He moved like winter itself, inevitable and unforgiving. Their eyes met across the arena. Alfred's expression didn't soften, but something passed between them, acknowledgement, promise, the wordless understanding they'd built over 2 months of dawn walks and shared breaking. Come back to me, Annie thought desperately. Please come back. The High Arbiter stepped into the circle, an ancient wolf whose authority in matters of traditional law was absolute. His voice carried across the arena with ceremonial weight. Lord Kieran Blackstone, you stand accused of treason, murder, and conspiracy against the crown. You have chosen trial by combat under ancient law. Do you accept the terms, victory grants vindication, defeat proves guilt? I accept, Kieran said smoothly. Alpha King Alfred, as challenger, do you swear to abide by the outcome as determined by combat? I swear it. Alfred's voice was granite. Then let the trial begin. Both men shifted in the same breath. The transformation was violent and immediate, bones restructuring, muscles expanding, humanity falling away to reveal the wolves beneath. Alfred's massive grey wolf stood easily a head taller than Kieran's sleek black predator, but Kieran moved with serpent-quick grace, circling with obvious confidence. The first strike came from Kieran, a lightning-fast lunge aimed at Alfred's throat. But Alfred wasn't there, flowing aside like water, his counterstrike catching Kieran's shoulder and drawing first blood. The crowd roared. What followed was brutal. Kieran fought dirty, using every underhanded tactic, feinting, using the sun to blind, targeting old wounds with surgical precision. And he talked, somehow his wolf's growls forming recognizable words through the combat. Did she scream? Kieran's wolf snarled, dodging another strike. Your precious Isabella? Did she beg when the poison finally started to work? Alfred's wolf didn't respond, didn't let rage dictate movement. He fought with cold precision, channeling 9 years of grief into focused strategy rather than blind fury. Every strike was calculated, every dodge efficient. He was fighting the way Annie had taught him to approach kingdom problems, with distance and clarity instead of emotion. 7 months I watched her waste away, Kieran continued, his voice mocking even as blood matted his black fur. 7 months of standing in your court, expressing concern while knowing exactly what was killing her. And you never suspected. You never even looked at me. Alfred's strike came so fast Annie almost missed it, a brutal combination that sent Kieran tumbling across the arena floor. But the black wolf rolled to his feet, still grinning with bared fangs. Even now you're too weak to finish it, Kieran taunted. Too controlled, too civilized. That's why I'll win. Because I'm willing to do what you're not. Alfred moved like lightning. One moment Kieran was speaking, the next, Alfred's massive jaws had closed around his throat, slamming him to the ground with enough force to crater the earth. Kieran's wolf thrashed, desperate, but Alfred's weight was absolute, his fangs positioned perfectly to tear out his windpipe with a single movement. The arena went silent. 10,000 wolves held their breath, waiting for the kill strike. It didn't come. Instead, Alfred's wolf shimmered and shifted, returning to human form still crouched over Kieran's prone wolf, his hand now gripping his throat where fangs had been. His voice rang out across the silent arena, clear and commanding. Justice demands truth, not just blood. He increased pressure on Kieran's throat, not enough to kill, but enough to force the shift. Kieran transformed back, gasping, naked and bleeding in the dirt, trapped beneath Alfred's implacable grip. Confess, Alfred commanded. Tell them what you did. Tell them how you poisoned my maid over 7 months. Tell them how you've orchestrated attacks on innocent villages. Tell them everything, or I'll make your death last hours instead of seconds. Kieran's face twisted with hatred, but Annie could see the calculation in his eyes, the realization that Alfred meant every word. That defying him now meant agony. I did it, Kieran spat, blood on his lips. I poisoned Isabella. I organized the village attacks. I've been working to destabilize your rule since the day you took the throne because you were never strong enough to deserve it. Enough, Alfred cut him off. He looked up at the High Arbiter. The confession is witnessed. The guilt is proven. Justice is served. Then, with clinical efficiency and no ceremony whatsoever, he broke Kieran's neck. The sound echoed across the silent arena. Kieran's body went limp. Alfred stood slowly, covered in blood and dirt, his expression carved from stone. He raised his voice to address the assembled thousands. Let this be understood throughout the kingdom, I will protect my people with every tool available, strength when needed, mercy when earned, and justice always. Those who threaten innocent lives will face consequences. Those who betray trust will answer for it. But I will not become the monster my enemies wish me to be. His eyes found Annie's across the arena. I will be the king this kingdom deserves. Strong enough to defend it. Wise enough to lead it. Human enough to remember that justice and vengeance are not the same thing. The crowd erupted. Not just cheering but roaring, a sound that shook the ancient stone and echoed across the capital. They weren't just celebrating victory. They were celebrating the return of a king who'd been lost in grief for 9 years and had finally found his way back. Alfred climbed the arena tiers toward the royal gallery, guards parting before him, nobles bowing. When he reached Annie, he was still covered in Kieran's blood, still breathing hard from combat, still more wolf than man in his eyes. But he was alive. He'd won. And he'd chosen justice over the rage that had consumed him for nearly a decade. Annie's vision blurred with tears as Alfred pulled her into his arms, heedless of blood and propriety and watching thousands. She held him tight, feeling his heart hammering against her chest, and whispered against his neck, "You came back." "I promised I would," Alfred said hoarsely. "I'm done losing people I love." Around them, the kingdom roared its approval, but Annie barely heard it. All that mattered was the man in her arms, broken and healing, strong and human, finally free. 3 days after the trial, Alfred's wounds were healing but still visible, claw marks across his ribs, bruising that painted his torso in purple and green. He'd spent most of that time in council meetings dealing with the political aftermath of Kieran's execution, emerging only for meals and the dawn walks with Annie that had become their ritual. On the morning of the 4th day, he appeared at her door earlier than usual, his expression unreadable in the pre-dawn light. "Walk with me." Something in his tone made Annie's stomach clench with apprehension, but she followed him through the quiet palace, past guards who nodded respectfully, into the gardens that had become their refuge. The roses were in full bloom now, their scent heavy in the cool air, and the fountain sang its constant song. They walked in silence to the marble bench where they'd first really talked, weeks ago when trust was still a fragile, uncertain thing. Alfred sat, and Annie joined him, her hands folded in her lap to stop their trembling. "The High Council met yesterday," Alfred said finally, staring at Isabella's roses. "They presented me with an ultimatum." Annie's heart dropped into her stomach. She'd known this was coming, had known since the first week that eventually politics would intrude on whatever strange connection they'd built. Kings didn't keep scarred women with no status or lineage around indefinitely. Not when kingdoms needed alliances and heirs and strategic marriages. "I understand," she said quietly, surprised her voice stayed steady. "I'll leave whenever you need me to. Marcus can help me arrange transport back to the borderlands." "Annie." Alfred turned to face her, his expression sharp. Let me finish. She closed her mouth, her throat tight. They gave me an ultimatum, he continued. Choose a noble woman with appropriate lineage and political connections within the month, or face potential rebellion from the noble houses who feel I'm neglecting my duty to secure the succession. His jaw tightened. They had a list prepared. Daughters of powerful alphas, women with impeccable bloodlines, alliances that would strengthen borders and fill coffers. Annie forced herself to breathe. This was it. The moment she'd been preparing for since the selection ceremony, the inevitable goodbye that came when temporary usefulness ended. I told them to prepare for disappointment. The words didn't register immediately. Annie stared at him, certain she'd misheard. What? Alfred reached out and took her scarred hand in his thumb tracing the raised tissue that marked her survival. You taught me something these past 2 months. Something I'd forgotten in 9 years of grief and rage. He met her eyes, and the vulnerability there stole her breath. You taught me that surviving isn't enough. That going through the motions of living without actually feeling anything is just a slower form of death. That I have to actually live, trust, and build something worth protecting, not just manage a kingdom, but create one worth being part of. His grip tightened on her hand. I don't want a political alliance, Annie. I don't want some perfectly bred noblewoman who sees me as a crown and a strategic advantage. I want a partner who understands what it costs to keep moving forward after tragedy tries to destroy you. I want someone who sees my worst moments and walks toward me instead of running away. I want someone who's honest enough to stop me from becoming a monster and strong enough to hold me when I break. Annie's vision blurred with tears she couldn't stop. Alfred. I want you, he said simply, fiercely. Not despite your scars or your lack of status or your damaged wolf. Because of them. Because those scars are proof that you survived when the world tried to kill you, and you're still here trying to build something meaningful from the wreckage. Because you're brilliant and brave and real in a way no one else in this palace has ever been. He slid from the bench onto one knee, still holding her hand, his gray eyes burning with intensity. Annie of Thornwood, I'm asking you to be my queen. To stand beside me and help me build a kingdom where broken people can heal, where surviving can transform into living, where strength means protecting the vulnerable instead of just accumulating power. The tears spilled over now, tracking down Annie's cheeks. The council will revolt. The noble houses will. Let them try, Alfred cut her off. I just killed a traitor in front of 10,000 witnesses. I'm done letting fear and politics dictate how I live. His voice gentled. But this only works if you want it to. If you believe you deserve this. Not because I chose you, but because you're choosing yourself, choosing to believe that your life has value, that you're worthy of happiness, that survival can become something more. For 5 years, Annie had carried the weight of survivor's guilt like a physical burden. Had believed that living while others died made her fundamentally undeserving of joy. Had made herself small and invisible because existing openly felt like theft from those who couldn't. But looking at Alfred now, this powerful king on his knees before her, offering not just a crown but genuine partnership built on shared wounds and hard-won trust, something cracked in her chest. Not breaking, but opening. Letting light into spaces that had been dark for so long she'd forgotten what warmth felt like. I was so certain I didn't deserve to be happy, she whispered. That survival was all I was allowed, and anything more was stealing from people who died. And now? Alfred asked quietly. Annie touched his face, traced the scar that ran from temple to cheekbone, met his eyes with her own blurred by tears. Now I think maybe Thornwood burned so I could be standing here in this moment. Maybe my mother screamed my name so I'd live long enough to find someone who needed me as much as I needed them. Maybe surviving was never theft, it was preparation for building something extraordinary from shared brokenness. She took a shaking breath. Yes. I'll be your queen. I'll stand beside you and help you transform this kingdom. I'll be your partner and your anchor and the person who sees you clearly. Her voice strengthened. Not despite my scars, but because of them. Because they're proof I survived, and surviving made me strong enough to deserve this. Alfred surged up and kissed her, fierce and gentle all at once, tasting like salt from her tears and promise and the dawn of something neither had believed possible months ago. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers. We're going to build something beautiful, he promised. Something worth all the years we spent drowning. Something that proves broken people can create extraordinary futures. Together, Annie agreed, the word feeling like a vow. Together, Alfred echoed. Around them, Isabella's roses bloomed in the dawn light, and somewhere in the palace, Marcus was probably already preparing for the political chaos that would follow this announcement. But in that moment, in the gardens where grief had first begun to transform into healing, a scarred survivor and a broken king chose each other, not as escape from their pasts, but as partners in building a future worth fighting for. It wasn't the end of their story. But it was the beginning of their life. The High Council fought the announcement for 3 days before Alfred made it clear that their opinions were noted and irrelevant. The king had chosen, and the kingdom would adapt or find itself facing a monarch who'd just proven his willingness to execute traitors in public. Most adapted quickly. 4 months later, the public square overflowed with citizens who'd traveled from every corner of the kingdom to witness something unprecedented, a queen's coronation held not in the exclusive throne room, but in the open air where common folk could attend. Annie stood in a preparation room overlooking the square, watching the crowd gather. She wore a gown of deep blue, Isabella's favorite color, chosen deliberately as honor rather than replacement, with silver embroidery that caught the sunlight. Her hair was arranged in a simple braid woven with white roses. And her scars were visible, uncovered, no longer hidden beneath cloaks or shame. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his weathered face soft with emotion. "They're ready for you, Your Majesty." The title still felt strange, but Annie was learning to accept it. "Is everyone here?" "Everyone who matters," Marcus confirmed with a knowing smile. Annie descended through the palace and emerged into the square to a roar of approval. Thousands packed the space, nobility in their finery mixed with farmers in their best clothes, merchants and healers and craftsmen, warriors and children. A kingdom gathered to witness not just a coronation, but a statement about who deserved recognition. Her eyes found the front row immediately. 7 people stood there wearing sprigs of lavender, the flower her mother had grown in Thornwood. Survivors who'd scattered after the fire but had reunited to witness one of their own crowned queen. Their faces were wet with tears, their hands clasped together, and Annie felt something break and heal simultaneously in her chest. Alfred waited at the center of the raised platform, dressed in formal regalia but smiling, actually smiling, warm and genuine in a way that still surprised her sometimes. Behind him stood Marcus, Commander Celine, and the High Arbiter who'd overseen Kieran's trial. Annie climbed the steps, and Alfred took her scarred hand in his, facing her before the assembled kingdom. The High Arbiter performed the traditional blessings, but everyone knew the real ceremony was in what came next, the personal vows that Alfred had insisted on including despite the council's protests. "Annie of Thornwood," Alfred began, his voice carrying across the silent square, "I choose you every day. Not because you healed me, though you did, but because you challenged me to become who I needed to be. You saw me at my worst and demanded I be better. You held me when I broke and trusted me to do the same for you. You taught me that strength without compassion is just brutality, and survival without purpose is just existence." His hands tightened on hers. "I choose you because you're brave enough to be vulnerable, strong enough to admit weakness, and wise enough to know that broken things can become beautiful when they're rebuilt with care and truth." Annie's throat was so tight she could barely breathe, but she forced the words out, her voice shaking but clear. "Alfred of the Silver Crown, I choose you because you taught me that my scars are proof of survival, not shame. That living through tragedy doesn't make me a thief stealing life from the dead, it makes me a testament to resilience." Tears tracked down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. "You saw me hiding behind a stone archway and decided I was worth choosing. You looked at damage and saw strength. You took my guilt and transformed it into purpose." She smiled through the tears. "I choose you because you're proof that broken people can rebuild themselves and each other. That grief doesn't have to destroy, it can transform. That the bravest thing we can do is trust someone else with our worst moments and believe we deserve their trust in return." The High Arbiter placed the crown on Annie's head, simple silver worked with roses, and declared her queen before the kingdom. The crowd erupted, but Annie barely heard it. She was too focused on Alfred pulling her close, kissing her while thousands cheered, and whispering against her lips, "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing me," Annie whispered back. "Thank you for teaching me I was worth choosing." The years that followed became legend. Alfred and Annie ruled together for 3 decades, transforming the kingdom in ways that honored both their pasts and their vision for the future. They established laws protecting displaced people, ensuring no one would be forgotten the way Thornwood had been forgotten. They created trauma recovery centers in every major settlement, places where survivors could heal without shame. They built schools that taught children from all backgrounds, trained healers, and sent them to the borderlands, reformed laws to protect the vulnerable rather than just the powerful. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, who grew up understanding that true nobility came from how you treated those who couldn't help you in return. Who learned that scars were stories worth honoring, not hiding. Who watched their parents rule with both strength and compassion, power and gentleness, justice and mercy. Every year on their anniversary, Alfred and Annie would return to the stone archway in the courtyard where she'd first hidden during the selection ceremony. They'd stand in the same spot where their eyes had first locked, remember who they'd been, broken, drowning, certain they didn't deserve happiness, and acknowledge who they'd become together. "We built something extraordinary," Alfred said on their 30th anniversary, his hair now silver, his face lined with years of laughter and hard decisions. From ashes and grief, Annie agreed, her own auburn hair streaked with white, her scars faded but still visible, still honored. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, like he did every year. "Choosing this life instead of staying invisible?" "Never," Annie answered, like she always did. "Because you taught me that surviving was just the beginning. Living, actually living, that's the extraordinary part." Their legacy outlived them. The kingdom they built became known not for military might or territorial expansion, but for being a place where second chances weren't just given, they were celebrated. Where broken people could find healing. Where no one had to hide to survive. Where strength meant protecting the vulnerable, and courage meant facing your wounds instead of burying them. Historians would debate their reign for generations, arguing about policies and politics, military strategies, and economic reforms. But the people who actually lived through it remembered something simpler, a scarred woman and a grief-stricken king who'd looked at each other across a crowded courtyard and decided that maybe, just maybe, 2 broken souls could build something beautiful together. And in doing so, they proved that the most profound transformations often begin with a single moment of being seen, truly seen, by someone brave enough to look at damage and recognize strength, to see survival and understand its cost, to witness brokenness and offer not pity, but partnership in the work of becoming whole. The Alpha King hadn't touched a woman in 9 years. Then he saw her and said, "Bring me that lady." What happened next didn't just save them both. It transformed an entire kingdom, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about perfection finding perfection, they're about 2 shattered people choosing to rebuild together, creating something far more beautiful than either could have imagined alone. And that, more than any crown or conquest, became their true legacy, the understanding that everyone, no matter how broken, how scarred, how certain they don't deserve it, deserves the opportunity to transform their pain into purpose, their survival into life, their loneliness into love. Second chances aren't weakness. They're the bravest thing we can offer each other. And sometimes, they're exactly what both king and commoner need to remember what it means to truly live.